but I'm not without fear.
But when we are together, it is our enemies who should be afraid.
It's not an overstatement to say that this killed a beloved Hollywood trope that had been flying strong for nearly 30 years. The 2006 release of Eragon should have been an easy layup for the increasingly fantasy-focused Hollywood machine. Instead, it was an abject failure. But calling Eragon a failure isn't quite harsh enough for what the movie actually did to the industry.
Let's talk about truth before we start talking about duty.
We've always been fascinated with fantastical creatures like dragons, and the innovations made in special effects during the early 80s and 90s meant that filmmakers could bring them to life more realistically than ever before. Most weren't exactly critical masterpieces.
Look what I found! How do you house train a dragon? Don't you be looking at me like that.
And still, they captured our attention and imagination in previously unseen ways. As the world moved onto the new millennium, it would have made sense for audiences to move on from fantasy. But then,
You shall not pass!
the Lord of the Rings movies dominated the public consciousness from 2001 until 2003, when Fellowship, Two Towers, and Return of the King became the biggest movies of their respective years. Add to that the outrageously popular Harry Potter series, and suddenly every movie studio on the planet was scrambling to produce their own fantasy franchise. And not just any fantasy franchise, it had to be one that was based on a successful book series for children or young adults with plenty of magical creatures. This is where Eragon comes in.
Eragon, listen to me.
Your shame is not mine.
You forgot what it means to be a dragon rider.
The first Eragon book was published in 2002 and written by first-time author and literal teenager Christopher Paolini. It wasn't a groundbreaking work of literary fiction by any means, since the hero's journey with a chosen one protagonist and an irredeemably evil royal villain was trite even in 2002. But its easily digestible tropes were like catnip for fantasy-hungry kids who made it a bestseller in 2003. And in 2006, the first Eragon movie in a planned trilogy was unleashed into movie theaters by 20th Century Fox. Obviously, that trilogy would never materialize, but back then, there was no way to know just how badly things would go. Eragon really was set up for success. Fox picked the perfect IP with a low barrier of entry with familiar tropes abound. They hit the sweet spot where the genre peaked in popularity, but similar features hadn't yet saturated the market. They stacked the cast with well-known talent like Jeremy Irons as the fatherly dragon-riding mentor Brahm, John Malkovich as the evil King Galbatorix, and Robert Carlyle as his henchman Durza. As for the rest of the roles, they were filled by unknowns who had the perfect look for 2000s tweens to swoon over. And by all measures, it should have worked. So why didn't it?
Let's see these skills of yours.
You know this won't be fair to you, old man.
Humor me.
Well, Eragon's production may as well have been under attack by King Galbatorix himself. Because of the mad dash the industry was in to acquire and push out fantasy films, Eragon was rushed into development sometime in 2003. While Jurassic Park 3 writer Peter Buckman is credited for the movie's screenplay, several others penned their own drafts and made substantial modifications, but simply weren't credited, all of whom struggled to bring Eragon to the big screen with any level of authenticity or quality. The secondary characters from the books are left by the wayside, with Brahm's story being especially butchered for the sake of time, and what few distinguishing details there were in the original story are stripped away. The Razak were downgraded to squealing orcish monsters, the elves and dwarves were skipped over entirely, and most of the lore was relegated to visual nods.
Beyond these borders are remnants of the resistance. Dwarves, elves, the Varden.
Bringing Galbatorix in for the film seems like a good idea at first blush, since it theoretically adds a much larger and more imposing threat while teasing what's to come in future installments. But he spends the whole movie trapped on a soundstage with absolutely nothing to do while spouting vaguely villainous phrases.
As long as I am king, disloyalty will be punishable by death.
All those scenes with Galbatorix ended up being a waste of time. And perhaps most damning of all, director Steven Fangmeyer had never actually directed a movie before, and after this, he'd never direct one again. Fangmeyer was primarily a special effects artist at George Lucas's Industrial Light and Magic, before being given his first big job, helming a would-be trilogy of big-budget fantasy films. A totally normal first project. Fangmeyer's experience in the world of visual effects colored his directorial style for better, but mostly for worse. It's clear when you watch the movie that there was a great deal of consideration put into how the dragon Saphira would be placed in any given scene. The CGI looks great, especially considering the condensed time frame the movie was being made under. Saphira seems to actually exist in the world. She's well lit, moves naturally, and has a real weight to her body. Her face even emotes intelligently.
You can hear my thoughts.
I have waited 1,000 years to hear your thoughts, and now you can hear mine.
It's when a real actor has to interact with her, climb on her back, or even just look her in the eye that things start to fall apart. That's probably why they opt for the shot-reverse shot more often than not. But it makes most of the scenes between our hero and his dragon feel very sterile and lacking in the bond that made Eragon even remotely unique. And since Fangmeyer had little to no experience directing actors, almost every performance in the movie felt stiff, which led to the whole thing feeling cold and emotionless. The actual design of the movie is another problem entirely. Book fans were up in arms over the feathers on Saphira's wings, the incorrect hair and eye color combinations of most of the cast, and the extremely generic and flat-out wrong costuming and weapons. This all culminated in an experience that pleased absolutely no one. It was too bland for non-fans and too inaccurate for book readers, leading to an absolutely abysmal showing at the domestic box office. It couldn't even make its estimated $100 million budget back and had to rely on international theaters to make up the difference. And critics weren't any kinder. Reviews for the film were scathing, and the pushback was so pronounced that it shook the industry to its core. The Lord of the Rings and Harry Potter movies had changed the level of expectation audiences had for these more magical stories. If a huge name in the game like Eragon wasn't guaranteed to make its money back, then what would?
But fortunately for you, your incompetence may work in my favor.
Suddenly going all in on mythological lizards didn't sound like such a foolproof idea. The fantasy genre suffered a mortal wound that day, but it was the dragons that took the brunt of the blow. They were dead, and it was Eragon's fault. It wasn't until 2010 that someone decided to pick up the dormant dragon egg and try to hatch it. That someone was DreamWorks with their animated movie, How to Train Your Dragon, an absolute massive success that inspired a trilogy of movies, 3 TV shows, a theme park land, and a live-action reboot. While essentially just a story about a boy and his big, bewinged dog, How to Train Your Dragon had the personality, emotionality, and overall quality audiences had craved from Eragon. And just 1 year later, Game of Thrones would become the biggest TV show, maybe ever, influencing not just the world of television, but also film for more than a decade. And hey, Stephen Fangmeyer got to oversee the effects for all 8 seasons. Dragons were officially back, and they haven't really left our screens since. But if it weren't for these 2 projects, Eragon likely would have been a much more definitive end for our favorite fantastical beast.
Did you know the people of the Varden already tell stories about you? The legend of Eragon, the great shade slayer, spreads throughout Alliasia.
Well, you know how legends go. People will believe just about anything these days.
And well, that's all we have for you today. Thanks so much for sticking around until the end of the video. If you liked what you saw, be sure to let us know by hitting the thumbs up and sounding off in the comments. And if you really liked it, consider subscribing to Nerdstalgic for more content just like this.